Hey everybody! It's been a few years since we did our How to Care for Ball Pythons guide, and since how you care for reptiles changes over time, we figured we'd give you an updated version today. Today we are going to show you what we consider a good, better, and best option for a ball python setup.
Who do you have there?
I have one of our banana ball pythons from the store who's going to help me out today. Yeah, you're helping. I needed a younger one for this, so yeah, this little dude gets to help out. Here is what we recommend for a good, basic ball python setup. This is essentially what we recommended for the ball python setup in our care video back in the day. We have aspen for a substrate, but since that's a rather dry substrate, to kind of help with humidity levels, we recommend a humidity box on the warm end of the enclosure, about halfway filled with damp sphagnum moss. And this should be fully enclosed, should be kept on the warm end so it stays hot and humid in there. And speaking of temperature, you of course need a warm end and a cool end, and since you can't use a basking lamp from above for this style of enclosure, you will need to use a heat mat that is regulated with a thermostat. The thermostat is essential if you're using a heat mat in any sort of reptile setup because this will regulate the heat mat and prevent it from overheating. The heat mat should be around a third of the size of the overall enclosure, and say this is our warm end. You'll want a hide, a fully enclosed hide, not something that's open on multiple ends so they can feel fully secure. You want one hide on the warm end and another hide on the cool end over here, and on the cool end is where I'd recommend putting their water dish as well. If you put the water dish on the warm end, it'll just evaporate more quickly and you'll have to refill it more frequently, but this will help increase your humidity, so I mean you can kind of play that to your advantage or to your needs. In addition to the hides, the humidity box, the water dish, I would also recommend putting in some sort of enrichment like cork bark, works great, maybe a fake plant or two, or just something to provide that mental stimulation for your snake. And lastly, you should choose a bin, I guess I should have mentioned this at the beginning, choose a bin that has positive locks to hold down that lid physically. If you choose a lid that just kind of clicks or rests on top of the bin, snakes are notorious for pushing up that style of lid and escaping, so you'll need something with these positive locks on the side. Now let's go over pros and cons for this environment and why it might work for you or why it might not. The nice thing is this is a very economical and space-saving environment to give to your ball python. If you have a lot of snakes and you need to save on space, this is a great option for you. If you are brand new to keeping ball pythons, this is also kind of a foolproof way to keep them, in my opinion. Although controversial, using aspen fibers as a substrate with a humidity box will allow your snake to choose what humidity level it wants to sit in, and therefore self-hydroregulate in its own environment. On the contrary, using a more tropical substrate, which we'll talk about later in the better setups, if the tropical substrate is kept too wet and a ball python is therefore sitting in something wet all the time, you'll start getting scale rot issues on their belly. So for somebody who's not quite certain how to keep the substrate a good moisture level, aspen is sometimes a safer route because you will not get scale rot issues using aspen fibers. However, aspen fibers are very dry, so if you use aspen fibers, you have to make sure that the moss in your humidity box is always kept damp. Again, not sopping wet or with standing water, just lightly damp to allow the snake to rehydrate itself and help promote healthy sheds. If you're going to use the bin setup, make sure you, of course, drill holes in the side for ventilation for your snake, and make sure that the bin is of an appropriate size for your species and age of snake. The general rule of thumb is that the minimum size of the bin should have 2 adjacent sides that are equal to or greater than the length of your snake. If you can, try to get a bin that's big enough so that only one side is the full length of your snake so that they can outstretch all the way along that side. If you're worried about a bin being too big, just add more enrichment in it to provide clutter so that your snake feels more secure. Another pro to the bin setup is that bins, being plastic, are cheap, they're lightweight, they're easy to clean and disinfect. However, this type of a setup isn't very visually appealing. I mean, when you have the lid on, even if it's a clear bin, that still blocks quite a bit of your view. It's not clear like glass is. So overall, this is what we would consider a good habitat for a ball python. There's a lot of controversy, again, with the aspen fibers, using them as a substrate, but I personally feel that as long as you supplement with a humidity box and you make sure that moss stays moist and damp, then it can work just fine. We know many ball pythons that have been kept in a similar setup to this for 20 plus years, and they eat well, they shed completely, and so on. So it definitely can work if you use it correctly. However, there are better options out there, so let's move on to what we consider a better setup. For a better setup, we recommend a front opening enclosure, and this, for example, is a 36 by 18 by 18 inch Enclosure enclosure. And the benefit of having an enclosure that opens from the front is that you don't have to move all of your lights and anything you have on top of the enclosure just to get into it. In addition, if you're reaching in from above to a snake, you look kind of like a predator to them, so a front opening enclosure helps make them feel safer when you reach in to take them out. So front opening enclosure is the way to go in our opinion. It also allows you to have more viewability of your snake inside. It's more of a display or centerpiece type setup as opposed to the bin setup. And internally we have a tropical substrate. There are a ton of different varieties or options as far as tropical substrates go. We find that mixing cocoa blocks with EcoEarth works really well to maintain humidity levels. And if you're not using dry or aspen fibers, for example, you don't have to supplement with a humidity box to allow the snake to hydroregulate. If you use a tropical substrate, they will have natural pockets of higher humidity areas within the enclosure. If you wanted, you can even choose a hide and put some damp sphagnum moss in that, but you don't need a special like plastic hide full of moss just to act as a humid retreat. Another nice thing about front opening enclosures, especially terrariums that are built specifically for higher humidity setups, would be this ventilation right here. Exoterra has built in, they're not a sponsor of this at all, these work really well. Having ventilation like this in the front and a screen on top promotes air circulation throughout the enclosure, and that will prevent condensation buildup on the front of the enclosure.
Known as the chimney effect.
Known as the chimney effect, exactly. Like before, let's say that the left-hand side is the warm end of the enclosure and the right-hand side is your cool end. For a front opening enclosure or something bigger, something glass-based with a tropical substrate, I would recommend a heat mat from below to warm up underneath those hides on that end. But unfortunately, heat mats aren't going to very well penetrate through a thicker substrate layer like this. So in addition to that, you'll also need, especially since this is a much deeper enclosure or taller enclosure rather than a plastic tote, you're going to need heat from above as well just to increase the overall ambient temperature of their environment. So for this, you can use either a basking lamp or a ceramic heat emitter or a deep heat projector just to raise that ambient temperature. They do benefit from a day and night light cycle just like they would encounter in the wild. So using a heat lamp like this, we'll kind of get both of those in one. It'll increase the temperature and it'll give them that day-night light cycle. However, a basking light will dry out your substrate faster than a ceramic heat emitter, so if you use a basking light, just make sure you keep a close eye on the tropical substrate to make sure it stays moist. Not wet, of course, because we talked about that earlier. You don't want them sitting on something constantly wet or you could get scale rot issues. You just want a moist or a lightly dampened substrate. And again, since we recommended it, if you use a heat mat, make sure you use a thermostat with it. If you decide to heat the warm end of the enclosure with a ceramic heat emitter or a deep heat projector, everything's still going to remain dark because neither of those provide any light or much light. So to still give them that day and night light cycle, you can provide them a UVB or an LED or a fluorescent light. A lot of people nowadays are actually providing UVB for ball pythons even though they are nocturnal, and a lot of people previously did not think they needed UVB. Newer studies are showing that they actually do benefit from it. So this type of environment, having the screen on top, allows you to give them UVB like they would still encounter in the wild. Another pro of this type of environment is that with so much more internal space, you have so much more room for activities. You can build your own sides, your own backgrounds. You can put so much more enrichment inside of the enclosure for them to explore on, and you can really customize it however you would like. A lot of people think that ball pythons don't climb and rather they're pet rocks that just kind of sit on the bottom of their enclosure in a cave. And while they do hide a lot, they also climb a lot, we've found. After giving ours the opportunity to climb, she is climbing like all the time. So I think ball pythons really do utilize vertical space more than we think. And if you're wondering what this is, we recommend putting a Pokemon card sleeve in the front so that you can put the name of your pet on the enclosure.
Yep.
Now that we've gone over a lot of the pros to this type of setup, let's talk about the cons. First off, this is a lot heavier of a setup than a plastic tote. But once you have it set up and in place, how often are you really going to need to move it? Second, glass is not a good insulator, so heat is going to escape this type of enclosure relatively quickly, and that's why you'll need probably an additional heat source in order to keep it warm enough for your ball python.
Glass also breaks.
Glass also does break.
We've seen lots of these tanks with cracks down the sides or cracks on the bottom, and once you get one of those cracks, you're not holding water in it anymore.
No, you're not. And then there's humidity. Since the entire top of this enclosure is screened, you may have to get creative and block off some of this screen. Otherwise, it's just going to dry out pretty quickly. Alternatively, Alternatively, you're just going to need to mist it a little bit more frequently than you would, say, in a bin setup. Another con is that this enclosure in particular from Exoterra won't be big enough for some adult ball pythons. This is the largest footprint of an enclosure that Exoterra makes, to our knowledge, so you would have to upgrade them in the long run. But those are really the only cons. Like, this is a nice setup. Price-wise, it's right in the middle of the road. It's not as cheap as a bin, but it's definitely still an affordable setup for something that looks really nice. But it gets even better than this, so let's talk about the best type of setup you can give your ball python. Now this is an example of a best setup for a ball python. This is a 4 by 2 by 2 foot enclosure that is front opening, and it's made of PVC, which helps hold in heat and humidity. It does have a screen lid, but this one in particular comes with a lid that you can punch out the holes that you need for the heating elements that you want to use, or the lighting elements you want to use. And yeah, this works really well size-wise and functionality-wise for ball pythons.
Do you want to explain who you shifted here?
Yeah, since this little guy would get dwarfed in this big of an enclosure, we actually put in our newest ball python who's in the tube right now. He's a banana morph that was sent to us by a fan, and he's actually going to live in our zoo after this video. Inside, we've got a fully bioactive enclosure. There are some fake plants while we wait for these smaller live plants to grow and really establish themselves in the enclosure, but we have live plants, there's springtails and isopods in here. For substrate, we just used actually a couple bags of the BioDude's Terra Firma. It works great as a bioactive substrate, especially if you want to do a bioactive enclosure but without the drainage layer. We have leaf litter in here to help hold in the moisture into that substrate and promote healthy plant growth. And we have lighting-wise or heat-wise a basking light from above. We don't have a heat mat on this one. In this enclosure, I mean, for something big like this, you could hook up a heat mat if you wanted, but again, since it would be tough for heat to penetrate through, in this case 4 inches of bioactive substrate, you're really going to need that overhead warmth in order to heat the entire enclosure. You can also add UVB into this style of enclosure, just like you could with the better ball python enclosure build. This enclosure in particular has a wider screen mesh on top so that it allows more UVB to penetrate through that screen, as opposed to some of the finer screen used on the top of like the Exoterra enclosures. In this style of enclosure, you again have more vertical space to play around with, and you can put in cork bark and vines and branches and driftwood for your ball python to climb on. And overall, you have just a lot more room for flexibility and creativity to build a truly beautiful centerpiece for your enclosure. Look at you, he's so cute. Oh my goodness.
Like what in the world? I really like this habitat.
Just like the previous enclosure we showed you, this one does have ventilation at the bottom that actually does reach underneath the track and into the enclosure to facilitate airflow, so you won't have that condensation buildup on the glass. We don't have the doors on this one just for ease of filming, but obviously this does have doors. You might be thinking to yourself, something like this is tough to build or tough to get, but it's actually the easiest enclosure Ed and I have ever built before. It took us maybe like 20 minutes. Okay, so we're building this enclosure for this ball python video, and this is the first time we've built the Evolution Series cage from Maximum Reptile / Snake Discovery, and it is truly the easiest enclosure we've ever built. No biases or anything. You literally just screw in all the sides and the holes are all pre-drilled. And
you don't even need instructions. It's just like 1, 2, 3, and then you just kind of go for it.
Yeah, you don't even need the instructions. You just follow the stickers on the sides and then you just put them on in order and then you're good to go. Not saying this is like a sponsored video or anything, but this is truly the best enclosure, in our opinion, for a ball python setup.
What you doing now?
Sealing the bottom so it's watertight.
Oh.
Yeah, fancy stuff.
Yeah, it's like we're rebuilding a zoo here.
Yeah, I'm getting flashbacks. Like the better version that we covered, you can customize even the background to this type of enclosure. You can do the Clint's Reptiles method of using Gorilla Glue to make a 3D background. You could get a Universal Rocks pre-cut background or decor kit, or you could make your own with foam. There are endless possibilities, and you can be as creative as you want to make an epic enclosure with something like this. And this size of an enclosure is going to be big enough for the entire life of your ball python, from when they're a baby to when they're a full-grown 4-foot adult. Even some of those outlier, like 5-6 foot females could live in something like this. That's how big it is. Plus, an enclosure like this is going to last you forever, and it's much less likely to break than, say, an Exoterra made of glass.
Yeah, empty, I can lift this one by myself, so it's a lot lighter as well.
Yeah, it is a lot lighter than glass too. So don't get us wrong, we don't have anything against the Exoterra or glass enclosures. We think they are awesome enclosures too. I just think if you want to take it up a step to the next level, something that's made of PVC and really high quality is going to be, you'll get your money's worth out of it. And with this type of enclosure, at least for this one sold by Custom Reptile Habitats, which we'll put links to in the description below, by the way, if you don't like seeing the lights or the electronics on top of your enclosure, they now make a hood that covers up all of those electronics and wires and lamps, so you don't even have to see them. It even comes with a temperature and humidity probe that displays what those levels are at all times on an LED screen, and with magnetic fronts, you can easily reach in to change bulbs and so on and so forth. So a hood actually helps transform this type of enclosure from being just an enclosure to being a piece of furniture in your house. This can also be used as a spacer to allow you to stack two enclosures, one on top of the other, because this is strong enough to hold another enclosure. There are really only two cons that we could think of for this enclosure, the first of which being the price, which being such a high quality enclosure, it is going to cost a little bit more than the good or better options for a ball python setup we showed you. This enclosure in particular costs about $400 plus shipping, but again, you are going to get your money's worth out of this enclosure. The second con is if you choose to go fully bioactive, there's a little bit of a learning curve with that. For example, you have to know what species of plants will go well in a ball python habitat. You also have to choose the right species of isopods that will thrive well in this type of environment, but it's very rewarding to do so because not only are you then taking care of a ball python, but you are also watching isopod and springtail colonies just bloom in the environment, as well as plants grow in the environment. So you really get to see an entire ecosystem at work in your living room. So overall, these are our picks for a good, better, and best habitat setup for a pet ball python. You can, of course, kind of Frankenstein your own version by using, say, the substrate from the best option, but the enclosure of the better option, and so on and so forth. And just keep in mind that everybody takes care of a ball python in a slightly different way, it seems. So don't just take our opinion on how to take care of your own ball python. Make sure to keep doing your research and get information from multiple sources so that in the end, you can make a well-informed and educated decision on what will make a great environment for your ball python. Thank you everybody so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, we'd like to thank our very generous Patreon backers who make videos like this possible, and we'll see you next time.